Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, sir, thank you so much for joining our Hacking for Defense class. We just shared your bio and summary of your extraordinary career, both in and out of uniform, and it's just quite a privilege to have some time with you this evening. As you know, you've been an inspiration for me personally since way back to my days as a Ranger Lieutenant when I think I first crossed paths with you when you blew by me on a PT test in the Ranger Battalion when you were this old 30-something major. But I've been trying to sprint and keep up with you ever since, and it's been a great run. But sir, thank you. I thought what I might do is start out with a few questions that I think might kind of motivate our students and help them as they take on this challenging curriculum in the Hacking for Defense class.
Absolutely.
So, sir, you know, when you were JSOC commander and many other jobs, I remember I was there in Balad in 2008. But the saying was, you know, you built a spaceship in flight, you know, but in these days with the proliferation of technology, you know, maintaining readiness and capabilities in the Defense Department, it's really relying less on the technology itself and more on the speed which it can be identified, adapted, and deployed. And certainly our adversaries like those you confronted with Al-Qaeda and others, you know, they're adaptive and have access to similar technologies. Can you comment on how organizations like the Defense Department and even startups can be more adaptive and operate at the speed needed to compete and win?
Yeah, Joe, I can. First, thanks for the years of serving together, Afghanistan, Iraq, and others. And thanks for what you're doing now. And that is a great question. Let me give you just a little historical sweep through my eyes. The military always had to buy stuff for a big group of people. So it spent a long time making sure it got the right thing, developing it, and then buying it, and then keeping it for theoretically a long time. And because a lot of technology was developed in the military, particularly in the United States, and we were ahead of most parts of the world, that was okay. It wasn't perfect, but it was okay. And we would field pretty good technology and it would go forward. What's happened now is with the democratization of technology, everybody has access to it. Every part of the world does. Precision strike is not something that the United States alone has, night vision, all those things at one point we had a monopoly on. What we found is that as more and more technology migrates in an opposite direction of where it used to, from government to commercial, now it's commercial to government, that means that it's available out there if you can figure out how to use it. Now, the flaw in the defense acquisition process is based upon requirements. Someone in the field comes up with a requirement, I need something to do this. It goes back through a process, and then an acquisition person tries to find something to meet that requirement. It's usually not based upon the person in the field knowing everything that's available. So they ask for something in a requirement based upon what they know. And so what we found in JSOC particularly was that was never going to give us what we needed. What we really needed to do was try to bring technologists closer to the problem so that they could see what the problem is, and then they could say, okay, there are a number of ways to go at this, and fresh eyes, but also take operators and get them back further upstream, closer to the technology, so they could get an idea of that. And they could start to say, wow, there's a different kind of technology that would be a very different approach to the way we have been thinking in the past. For it to work in JSOC, we had to have separate acquisition authorities, which we did. We were allowed to buy things outside of the normal process, and we had plenty of money. So what we would do is we would allow people to buy stuff and just use it, just try to figure it out. And we probably had, warehouses full of good ideas that weren't, things that we tried for a little while. But we found a lot of things. We'd come and we'd just give it to operators, and we'd say, can you find a way to make this work or to be useful to you? And what they would do is they would figure it out up close to the problem, iterating on it. That's what I think America's going to have to do in the future. And that's a little frightening, because if, the theory is you go into the war with the army you've got, the equipment you've got, you may go into the war, but in reality, we didn't have a single MRAP when we went into Iraq or Afghanistan, and then we produced thousands of them. I think that what's going to be needed in the next decades, and maybe, as far as we can see, it's who can figure out how to develop things quickest after the war has started. Because I don't think either side now knows how the next war is going to go. We don't know what technologies we're going to work. We don't know how much cyber is really going to do. We think a lot, but we'll see. There are all kinds of other things that until they're used, it's not going to be sure what their impact is. So who iterates fastest once both sides start figuring that out is going to be key. Who can iterate fastest, produce it fast enough, and use it fastest, which means you need a different kind of industrial base. You need sort of a hot stove with a bunch of different ingredients until somebody tells you what they want to eat, kind of like a restaurant. Again, that's a completely different way of going at it than we have in the past. And it's a little bit playing chicken, because you're saying, I'm not going to build a bunch of stuff. I'm going to build less stuff, and I'm going to be ready. And I just bet I can be faster than the enemy.
Thanks for that's a lean startup approach in many ways. So you've built some amazing teams in the military and now in the private sector. Fantastic book, Team of Teams. Had the privilege of reading. In the Hacking for Defense course, we have diverse 4 to 5 student member teams working on solving some important problems that are facing the DoD and the intelligence community. And we have engineers, scientists, business students, law students. They all come together to work on these problems. Could you comment on what makes a good team, and maybe give our students advice on working effectively as a team and getting the most out of their diverse members?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that makes a good team is clarity of what they're trying to do. Somebody's got to give them clear direction of what they're trying to accomplish. That seems easy. It's really not. You've got to give people an idea and the timeline and all that sort of thing. Then when you try to build a team, you remember, because we were, I was older than you, but most people in our organizations, Rangers and JSOC, look like us, sort of middle-class white guys. There were not a lot of women, there were not a lot of minorities, and it was self-selected. You go into those processes. It wasn't a racist to keeping people out, but you don't try to join a club you don't think you're going to fit into. So it took the fight really in Iraq. We had little pieces of it before, but it took the fight in Iraq where it was sort of a desperate fight, where we needed to be as effective as we could be, more effective than we had been, that a meritocracy really started to come out. Because before that, it was a little bit about what you've done in the last war, how big your shoulders were, and that sort of thing. And then we got in Iraq, and all that mattered is what you could produce here. And the most important thing was results, which was often intelligence-based, or it was being able to leverage the assets of other organizations, bringing that together. So those skills became incredibly important. And the traditional skills of, could I kick down the door and shoot straight? Could I fly a helicopter? Those actually became commoditized. You could get those easily enough. You couldn't replace those people who could get a team to work together. And some of those were really not trained skills. They were as much personality traits as skills. What we found is, if you're going to try to build a diverse team, you need diverse talent. You need to bring people with different perspectives. That doesn't mean men, women, and minorities. That means people with different viewpoints and experiences, State Department people, FBI people, CIA people. And you've got to get them in an environment where their inputs are used. The loudest voice doesn't always win. So the most critical aspect we always found in forming the joint interagency task forces or fusion cells was picking the right leader and picking a person who understood that and could shape that environment. And that person did not have to be an expert in what they were doing, didn't have to understand intelligence, didn't have to understand those things, just had to be someone who understood that you're molding an organization. The organization will then get the job done. And it can be as small as 3 or 4 people. It can be as big as 100 in one of these JIADFs or something. But it's that leader setting the tone, setting the discipline of an operating rhythm and that sort of thing.
Thank you, sir. General McChrystal, you've been a tremendous advocate for public service and expanding the opportunities for public service. Hacking for Defense, the course, it strives to provide our students with an opportunity to close the civil military gap, which I think we agree exists, and engage in public service. What advice would you give America's best and brightest students, such as those at Stanford and universities across the country, on how to serve and make a difference, maybe short of joining the military or the U.S. government?
Yeah, you don't have to join the military or the U.S. government to make a difference in society. There are so many things you can do for your fellow people in local areas or in nonprofits and things. But there are also times when there may be some call to serve a larger purpose, like against COVID-19, the moral equivalent of war and the practical equivalent of war, or if the nation is getting ready for war. And then you may need to step in and give your part in whatever your particular expertise is. I think the first thing is to understand there is a larger than you. I don't care who you are, and if you're that large, there's a larger than you, and there's something that matters. And a way to think about it is we make a commitment to be citizens. Most of us got our citizenship by accident of birth. We didn't do anything for it. And we got rights with that. We also got responsibilities with that. And the responsibilities aren't just to ourselves or just to vote. They're responsibilities to other citizens. Now, there are times we've got to get down in the mud and dig mud because that's what has to be done. There are times we've got to pay higher taxes because that's what's needed. There's times we've got to socially distance because that's what's needed. There are times we have to put on a uniform and go to war, even though we don't love war, because that's what's needed. And so I think the first thing is sort of crossing the bridge and understanding that you have responsibilities. This is not all just personal choice in life. You do, however, get a personal choice. And one of those personal choices is how you're going to view responsibility. And so if you make that decision that you are going to accept responsibilities, not all exactly what you want, but then contribute to the best, I personally think it's pretty fulfilling.
Fantastic, sir. So we've got a few more questions from some students if you
Sure.
have time.
Yeah.
Well, actually, so actually one more from the moderator. You mentioned the importance of leadership. The lean methods that we use in this course that one of our course author, Steve Blank, helped develop. It requires students to what we call get out of the building, go out and talk to beneficiaries, the people close to the problem, to understand the problem. Don't come to them with a solution, if you will. But during these currently very challenging times, how can you lead like a startup founder lead through unpredictability when there's such a dearth of information out there and it's so much harder to get the information you need?
Yeah, that's an interesting problem I hadn't really thought about before. I think to lead in a lean environment, you need to do two things. First is you need to be able to get the feedback from your team and from the potential consumers of the product, et cetera. I think in today's world, we're going to have to migrate to doing a lot more virtually. We've always thought you couldn't sell things virtually. You had to sell things face-to-face, backslap, and that sort of thing. I think that is going to change. I think buyers are going to be willing to buy virtually, and sellers are going to have to learn to sell virtually. So I think the same way as getting feedback, you're going to have to develop relationships with people based on trust, and like video is the best. You build trust with somebody, live up to that, and then ask their feedback. And it's in their interest to give feedback because they'll get a better product. The other thing that you have to do for an effective lean environment is be willing to fail. We always say, fail, fail fast, we'll celebrate failure. But how many leaders really celebrate failure? How many people want to have a bunch of failures or are willing to have a bunch? And that's a smaller number. I think we are going to have to be willing to do that, which is harder in a distributed environment. Because if you are in the same room and you look at me and you say, Stan, I'd like to try X, and I touch you on the shoulder, I say, go for it, and you fail, and then you come back, and I've watched it, and then I go, okay, good try, Joe. Better luck next time. That's easier than if you're at the end of a telephone or an email or even a video call, and you want to do something. We really didn't have quite the same connection. And then you get on the phone and you say, we fail completely. There's less comfort. And so we're going to have learn how to build relationships where we're willing to take that kind of risk and have that kind of, negative outcome.
So you mentioned failing fast. We have a student, Nick, from Team Omniscient, and his question is, how can the Defense Department fail small, fast, and cheap to keep up with the technology and personnel management changes when it operates in an environment? And this is what I think is key, where failure can have such deadly consequences.
Yeah, it's funny. It's just right now not in the DNA. There are some people in DOD who believe this and whatnot, but right now the system is take the requirements, do a bunch of study of them, down select, pick one, bet on it. And once you bet on it and start to do detailed development and production, people are wedded to it. You have people whose professional lives, their credibility is hooked into that program, to producing that thing. And then there are certain people who just become very, very strong advocates of it because that's a psychological reality to it. I think we're going to have to get better at using data faster as we assess things. As soon as it's like algorithms for a quant investor, they use an algorithm as long as it works. As soon as it doesn't work, the good ones will say, cut losses and move on. Don't be emotional about it. It's stopped working, stop it. That's got to be built into the mindset of the people who are developing and the people who are funding it. We got to be willing to go pretty far down a road, which costs a lot of money, and then say, yep, that was a great idea and it was a great try, doesn't work, or we don't need that anymore. And then just be willing to go, stop, boom. We've canceled big programs in the past, but usually they're canceled because the funding is not there anymore. And a painful decision is made to forego something everybody would really like, but they can't afford. We very rarely have canceled something because it's just not what we thought it would be, or didn't perform as advertised.
So if I could sneak one more in under the wire.
Yeah.
Nate, one of our teaching assistants and a veteran student of last year's Hacking for Defense class, his question is, well, first, our course, we take problems that DoD organizations have and create problem statements and have our students work on them. But Nate's question is, what are the greatest national security threats faced by our nation today? And if you could write a Hacking for Defense problem statement, what would it be? I know that's a good question, but you could take a shot at that.
Well, I mean, the first one is an answer, but it's not relevant really for this course. The biggest threat we have to national security is our inability for our government to function in an effective way. The partisanship, that is an existential threat, and our enemies see it and they know that it's a problem. The second one is probably our education system. We are not producing the number of people we need with the right educational bona fides and skills to compete in the future. That was okay 50 years ago because the whole world wasn't competing with us. Now it is. So those are the two that jump out. But I think if I think about it, it is the ability for otherwise non-competitive competitors, meaning smaller entities, they may be nation states, they may be not, to leverage technology in a disproportionate way. You know, think of cheap drones with weaponry on them becoming precision strike. Think of weapon of mass destruction created in a way, and whether it's biological, chemical, or whatever. Those things can have outsized effect. You know, before this age, people could be against you and they could hurt you and they could cause problems. Nowadays, theoretically, somebody could do blows that could almost be fatal to a country if you could get at its health, if you could get at its economy, its stock market, its information system. And even less than perfect strikes on 3 or 4 of those could put our society at a standstill. And then I think that is pretty terrifying. And the problem with those kinds of foes is it's hard to deter them because a small country or a terrorist group can't be held hostage the same way a peer competitor can because they don't have as much to lose. So those are the ones that very much worry me. But it's impossible to anticipate every one of those. So if you try to do a counter for everyone, it's just too many to try to do.
Well, sir, it's I know I've exceeded my time a bit, but it's just been an extraordinary privilege to have you join our class and inspire us. You know, everyone's familiar with your storied military career, but if I'll say it here for the record, I think some of your public service impact is still ahead of you. Thanks for all you continue to do for all of us, sir, and I really appreciate you joining our class today.
All right. As soon as we can travel again, I'll be back out in the valley and we'll have a beer.
Look forward to that, sir, very much.
I do too, Joe. Take care.